The morning air in the small neighborhood always carried the same quiet feeling. It was not the peaceful kind of quiet that people talk about when they imagine calm places. It was the quiet of people waking up early for long days, the quiet of tired footsteps, and the quiet of lives that never seemed to slow down. In a narrow street lined with old buildings and small food stalls lived a young girl who understood this quiet better than most people her age. Her home was a tiny rented room above a repair shop. The room had one small window that looked down at the busy street below. The paint on the walls had faded long ago, and the ceiling fan made a slow, rattling sound whenever it turned. But even in that small space, life continued every day. Before the sun fully rose, the girl was already awake. She moved carefully so she would not wake her mother too early. Her mother worked long hours cleaning offices and shops across the city. Most nights she returned home very late, her feet sore and her shoulders tired. The girl often watched her mother fall asleep almost instantly after lying down. She never complained, never spoke about how exhausting the work was. Instead, she would smile and say everything would be fine. The girl believed her. Each morning she prepared simple tea using a small kettle near the window. Sometimes there was bread left from the day before. Sometimes there wasn't. But she had learned not to focus too much on what was missing. After getting ready for school, she would quietly step out into the street. The neighborhood was already alive by then. Street vendors were arranging fruits on wooden carts. Mechanics were opening the metal shutters of their shops. Buses and motorbikes rushed past, filling the air with noise. The girl walked through it all with a calm expression, carrying an old backpack that had been carefully repaired many times. Her school was not far away. It was a public building that had seen better years. The classrooms were crowded, and the desks were worn down from many students using them over time. But the girl did not mind. She listened carefully to her teachers and tried her best in every subject. Still, there was one thing that always captured her attention more than anything else. Music. The school had no music class. There were no instruments, no piano, no teacher who talked about melodies or rhythm. Yet music somehow found its way into her life anyway. Sometimes it came from a radio playing in a nearby shop. Sometimes from a phone someone carried on the street. Even a simple tune hummed by a stranger could catch her attention. When she heard music, something inside her felt different. She could not explain it in words. It felt like the sound reached a place deep in her mind where everything else became quiet. She began to notice small patterns in melodies. She could remember tunes after hearing them only once or twice. Sometimes she tapped her fingers lightly on desks or tables, imagining the sounds of instruments she had never touched before. But there was one place in the city where music felt more powerful than anywhere else. Every afternoon after school, the girl walked home along the same route. The path passed through a busier part of the city where tall buildings and expensive stores stood side by side. Among those buildings was a large hotel that looked very different from everything else around it. The building was tall and bright, with glass doors that reflected the sunlight. Fancy cars often stopped at the entrance, and people dressed in elegant clothes walked in and out. The girl always slowed down when she reached that corner. Through the wide glass windows, she could see a large open lobby with soft lights and comfortable chairs. But what caught her attention the most was the grand piano placed near the center of the room. It was beautiful. Even from outside, she could see the smooth black surface shining under the lights. The piano looked almost like a piece of art placed carefully in the middle of the room. Sometimes a musician sat there and played while guests talked quietly nearby. Whenever that happened, the girl stopped walking completely. She stood near the edge of the sidewalk and listened. The sounds drifting through the glass doors felt magical to her. Each note carried emotion she had never heard anywhere else. The music seemed to tell stories without using a single word. People passing by often continued walking without noticing anything special. But for the girl, those moments felt important. She watched the musician's hands moving across the keys, trying to understand how such beautiful sounds were created. Many days she stood there for several minutes before continuing home. At first, she felt a little shy about stopping like that. She worried that someone might think she was strange. But after some time, she stopped caring. Listening to the piano made her happy. Some evenings the hotel lobby was empty, and the piano remained silent. On those days she still paused for a moment, staring through the glass. She imagined what it would feel like to sit on that bench. She imagined placing her fingers on the keys and hearing the notes come alive. The thought felt almost impossible. Places like that hotel were meant for people who lived very different lives. Everyone inside wore clean suits, elegant dresses, and polished shoes. The girl often looked down at her own worn shoes and simple clothes. She knew she did not belong there. Yet the dream stayed quietly inside her heart. One afternoon, something unusual happened. The girl was standing in her usual spot outside the hotel when the musician playing the piano finished a song and stood up. A hotel worker quickly approached and closed the piano lid. For a while, no one played. Guests continued walking through the lobby, chatting and laughing, but the piano remained untouched. The girl watched the empty bench with curiosity. For the first time, she realized that the instrument sometimes sat there waiting for someone to play it. Waiting. That thought stayed with her as she continued walking home. That evening, while sitting near the window in her small room, she found herself thinking about the piano again. Her mother had not returned from work yet, so the room was quiet except for the distant sounds of traffic outside. The girl placed her hands on the wooden table and lightly tapped her fingers. She imagined the table was a piano. Her fingers moved slowly, following the memory of melodies she had heard through the hotel windows. Soft tapping sounds filled the room as she tried to recreate the rhythm. The music existed only in her imagination, but it felt real enough to make her smile. She practiced this quiet game often. Whenever she found a flat surface, she pretended it was a piano. A table, a desk, even her school notebook sometimes became imaginary keys under her fingers. She didn't know the names of musical notes. She didn't understand music theory, but she listened carefully whenever she heard a melody somewhere in the city. Her mind remembered the patterns. Days passed in this simple routine. School in the morning. The walk past the hotel in the afternoon. The quiet tapping practice at home. None of it seemed extraordinary. Yet slowly, something inside the girl continued growing stronger. Her connection with music deepened with every passing day. Then one evening, the city prepared for a large event at the hotel. Bright lights were placed near the entrance, and several workers moved quickly in and out carrying decorations. Fancy cars lined the street as guests began arriving. The girl noticed everything while standing at her usual corner. The lobby looked more elegant than ever. Beautiful flowers were arranged near the piano, and soft music played through hidden speakers. It seemed like an important celebration. She watched quietly for a while, wondering what kind of music might be played that night. Then a small thought appeared in her mind. It was a simple idea, but it made her heart beat faster. The piano would be there, and maybe, just maybe, there might be a moment when no one was playing. The thought felt both exciting and frightening at the same time. She looked down at the sidewalk, then back at the bright hotel lobby. For a long moment she stood there, thinking about something she had never dared to consider before. What if she walked inside? What if she simply asked to play one song? The idea sounded impossible. People like her did not walk into places like that. They certainly did not sit at expensive instruments in front of wealthy guests. Yet the dream she had carried quietly for so long refused to disappear. The girl stayed there longer than usual that evening, watching the piano through the glass doors. Inside her mind, the same question repeated again and again. What if she tried? She didn't know it yet, but the choice she was about to make would soon change everything. The evening slowly settled over the city, and the street outside the large hotel became brighter than usual. Strings of warm lights hung above the entrance, and the soft glow reflected on the polished cars that kept arriving one after another. Drivers stepped out quickly to open doors, and guests dressed in elegant clothes walked toward the glass entrance with quiet confidence. From the corner of the sidewalk, the girl watched everything carefully. She had passed this building many times before, but tonight felt different. The hotel looked even more grand than usual. Flowers were arranged near the doors, and 2 staff members stood near the entrance welcoming guests politely. The girl stood a little farther away than normal, unsure of what to do. Her hands rested lightly on the straps of her worn backpack. Inside her mind, the thought that had appeared earlier refused to disappear. What if she went inside? The idea felt bold, almost impossible. But something inside her kept pushing the thought forward. She looked through the glass doors again. The grand piano was still there, placed near the center of the lobby. The black surface shined under the warm lights, and the bench in front of it sat empty. For a moment, her heart beat a little faster. Guests walked past the piano without paying much attention to it. Some stopped to talk near the tables. Others walked toward the large hall where the event seemed to be taking place. The piano was quiet. The girl slowly took a step forward. Then another. Her shoes touched the smooth pavement near the entrance, and she suddenly became very aware of how different she looked compared to everyone around her. The guests wore clean suits and elegant dresses. Their voices were calm and confident. She looked down at her own clothes. They were neat but simple, carefully washed many times. Her shoes were worn at the edges. For a moment, doubt filled her mind. Maybe she should leave. Maybe she should just walk home like every other day. But then she heard a few soft piano notes from inside the building. Someone had briefly touched the keys while adjusting something. The sound drifted out through the open door. It was only a short sound, but it reminded her why she had come this far. Her feet moved again before fear could stop her. The girl walked toward the entrance slowly. One of the hotel staff members noticed her almost immediately. His polite smile faded slightly as he looked at her clothes and hesitant steps. He stepped forward, blocking the path gently. "Can I help you?" he asked in a calm voice. The girl looked up at him. For a second, words did not come easily. She was not used to speaking in places like this. But she gathered her courage. I just wanted to see the piano," she said quietly. The staff member looked confused for a moment. Then he glanced behind him at the lobby. Guests continued moving around, and the sound of conversation filled the air. "This is a private event tonight," he replied politely. "Only invited guests are allowed inside." The girl nodded slowly. She had expected something like this. But before she could step away, another staff member walked over. He had heard part of the conversation. "What's going on?" he asked. The first man explained briefly. The second man looked at the girl with curiosity. "You want to see the piano?" he asked. She nodded again. For a moment, both men looked at each other. Then the second staff member shrugged slightly. "She's not causing trouble," he said. "Let her stand near the lobby for a minute." The first man hesitated, but then stepped aside. The girl felt a small wave of relief as she walked through the glass doors. The lobby felt even bigger from inside. Soft lights glowed from the ceiling, and the floor reflected the light like a mirror. The air carried a light scent of flowers and polished wood. People moved around the room, holding drinks and talking quietly. Their laughter echoed softly against the high walls. But the girl's eyes focused on only one thing: the piano. It stood only a short distance away now. Her steps slowed as she approached it. Up close, the instrument looked even more beautiful than she had imagined. The smooth black surface reflected the lights above, and the keys were perfectly arranged like small pieces of art. She had never been this close to a real piano before. For a moment, she simply stood there and looked at it. Her fingers twitched slightly, as if they already wanted to touch the keys. A few guests nearby noticed her. At first, they seemed curious. A young girl standing near the piano during a formal event looked unusual. Whispers slowly began. "Who is she? Is she part of the event? Maybe someone's daughter?" But when people noticed her simple clothes and uncertain posture, the whispers changed. A small group of well-dressed guests stood near a tall table not far away. One of them looked at the girl and raised an eyebrow. "She doesn't look like she belongs here," he said quietly to the others. Another person chuckled softly. The girl heard some of the whispers, but she tried not to let them affect her. Her attention stayed on the piano. A musician who had played earlier during the evening had already left the lobby. The instrument sat quietly, waiting for the next performance later in the night. The girl looked around for a moment. No one was sitting at the piano. Her heart started beating faster again. She slowly turned toward one of the hotel staff members standing nearby. "Excuse me," she said politely. The man looked down at her. "Yes." She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "May I play one song?" she asked softly. The question surprised him. He blinked once, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You want to play the piano?" he asked. She nodded. The staff member glanced around the lobby as if checking whether someone else had heard the request. A few nearby guests had noticed the conversation. One of them laughed lightly. "She wants to play?" the guest repeated with amusement. The laughter spread quickly among the small group. Another guest shook his head, smiling as if the situation were entertaining. "This should be interesting," someone said. The girl felt her face grow warm, but she stayed calm. She was not asking to perform for attention. She only wanted to play a song she had carried in her heart for a long time. The staff member looked uncomfortable. "This piano is for professional musicians," he explained carefully. "We cannot allow guests to play it." "I only want to play one song," the girl said quietly. Her voice was gentle but steady. The group of guests nearby continued watching the situation. One of them laughed again. "Let her try," he said jokingly. "It might be funny." Another person added, "Yes, maybe she knows something we don't." Their tone was playful but not kind. More people in the lobby began turning toward the piano, curious about the strange conversation. The girl could feel their eyes on her. Some looked amused. Some looked doubtful. Others simply watched with curiosity. The staff member hesitated again. He did not want to cause a scene, especially during such an important event. Finally, he sighed quietly. "One song," he said. "Only for a moment." The guests nearby smiled as if they were about to watch a small joke unfold. The girl nodded gratefully. Her heart was beating so loudly now that she could almost hear it. Slowly, she walked toward the piano bench. Every step felt heavier than the last. The room grew quieter as people noticed what was about to happen. Several guests even took out their phones, expecting an awkward or funny moment. The girl reached the bench and sat down carefully. For the first time in her life, she was sitting in front of a real piano. The keys stretched out in front of her like a path waiting to be explored. She placed her hands gently on her lap for a moment. Around her, quiet laughter still floated through the air. But the girl did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the piano. Then she slowly lifted her hands and placed her fingers on the keys. The room held its breath, and the first note was about to be played. For a brief moment, the entire lobby seemed to pause. The girl sat quietly on the piano bench, her small hands resting gently on the smooth keys. The bright lights above reflected on the piano's surface, and the polished floor beneath her shoes felt almost too perfect for someone who had grown up walking on cracked streets. Around her, people watched with different expressions. Some guests stood with folded arms, waiting for something amusing to happen. A few whispered to each other, smiling as if they were about to witness a small joke. Others simply looked curious, wondering why a girl in simple clothes had been allowed to sit at the elegant instrument. The girl noticed the attention, but she tried not to let it enter her mind. Instead, she focused on the piano. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, and for a second she did not move at all. She could feel the smooth surface under her fingertips. It was cool and perfect, nothing like the wooden tables she used at home when she imagined practicing. Her heart was beating quickly. She had dreamed of touching a piano like this for so long. Yet now that the moment had come, everything felt almost unreal. For a second, a quiet thought appeared in her mind. What if she made a mistake? What if the music in her head did not come out the way she imagined? The laughter from earlier echoed faintly in her memory. But then she remembered something simple. Music had always felt natural to her. She did not need anyone's permission to feel it. Slowly, she took a soft breath and closed her eyes. The noise of the lobby faded away. The whispers, the footsteps, the distant sounds of glasses clinking. Everything became quieter in her mind. All she could think about was the melody she had carried inside her for so long. Her fingers moved. The first note appeared softly in the air. It was gentle and clear, like a small drop of water falling into a still lake. Some people near the piano raised their eyebrows slightly. The girl pressed another key, then another. The melody began slowly, almost like someone speaking in a quiet voice. At first, a few guests continued talking, expecting the sound to stop at any moment. But something unusual began to happen. The notes did not sound random. They flowed together in a calm and beautiful pattern. The girl's fingers moved carefully across the keys, as if they already knew where to go. Each note connected to the next with a quiet confidence. A guest who had been laughing earlier suddenly stopped speaking. He turned his head slightly toward the piano, listening more carefully. Another person lowered their phone. The melody continued growing. It was simple, but it carried emotion in a way that made people pause. The music did not feel forced or rehearsed. Instead, it felt honest, like a story being told without words. The girl opened her eyes slowly and looked down at the keys. Her hands moved more freely now. The nervousness she felt earlier began to fade. The piano no longer felt like a strange object in an expensive hotel. It felt like something familiar, something she had known in her heart for a long time. Outside the large glass windows, cars continued moving through the city streets. But inside the lobby, the atmosphere slowly began to change. More guests turned toward the piano. Conversations faded. The sound of the melody filled the room gently. One older guest standing near the back leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. The girl's playing was not loud or dramatic. Instead, it carried a quiet beauty that seemed to reach people in unexpected ways. Her fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence. Sometimes the notes were soft and slow, like someone walking through a peaceful memory. Other moments became brighter and quicker, as if the music itself was smiling. No one had expected this. Not the guests, not the hotel staff, and certainly not the small group of people who had laughed when the girl first asked to play. The same guest who had joked earlier now watched in silence. His expression had changed completely. The girl continued playing, unaware of how the room had transformed. For her, the music was not about the crowd. It was about everything she had felt during those afternoons standing outside the hotel windows. Every moment she had listened to the piano from the sidewalk. Every quiet evening tapping melodies on the table at home. Every dream she had carried silently inside her heart. All those feelings flowed into the music. Her hands moved smoothly across the keyboard, sometimes traveling farther than she had imagined possible. Yet each note felt right, as if the melody was guiding her fingers. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Even the hotel staff who had been busy earlier now stood still. One waiter carrying a tray had paused near a table, listening without realizing he had stopped walking. Near the entrance, the two staff members who had spoken to the girl earlier exchanged surprised glances. Neither of them had expected anything like this. A soft section of the melody began, and the girl's hands slowed again. The notes floated through the lobby like gentle waves. A woman standing near the piano placed her hand lightly over her mouth. Her eyes followed the movement of the girl's fingers with deep attention. There was something special in the music, something that felt sincere and real. People who had never met the girl before could somehow feel the emotion behind each note. The melody slowly began to grow stronger. The girl's fingers moved faster now, creating a richer sound that filled the entire space. It was no longer background music. It was the center of the room. Several guests had moved closer without realizing it. They formed a quiet circle around the piano, watching the girl play. Some looked amazed. Others looked thoughtful. But none of them were laughing anymore. The music continued building, reaching a moment that felt powerful yet graceful. For someone who had never touched a real piano before, the girl seemed strangely comfortable. Her shoulders relaxed as she played. Her hands moved with natural rhythm. The notes rose and fell like a living conversation between her heart and the instrument. At the far side of the lobby, a man who had been speaking with event organizers suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He turned toward the piano, listening carefully. "Who is playing?" he asked quietly. But no one answered, because no one had expected the answer. The melody reached its most emotional part. The girl pressed the keys with gentle strength, creating a sound that filled the air with warmth and feeling. It was the kind of music that made people pause and reflect, even if they did not fully understand why. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed down inside the hotel. All because of a girl who had simply asked to play one song. And the most surprising part was still yet to come. The music continued flowing through the lobby like a quiet river. By now, almost everyone in the room had stopped what they were doing. Conversations that once filled the space had slowly faded away. The soft laughter that had been heard earlier was completely gone. People who had been walking toward the event hall were now standing still near the entrance, looking toward the piano. A few guests had even stepped closer without realizing it, drawn by the sound of the melody. The girl sitting at the piano seemed unaware of the growing crowd around her. Her attention remained on the keys. Her fingers moved naturally, pressing one note after another as if the music had been waiting inside her for years. The melody carried a deep emotion that felt simple but powerful at the same time. Some parts of the song were soft and gentle, like quiet memories floating through someone's mind. Other moments became brighter and stronger, filling the room with a warmth that people could feel in their chest. The polished walls of the lobby reflected the sound, making the music travel smoothly through every corner of the space. Near one of the tall windows, an older guest slowly lowered the glass he had been holding. His eyes stayed fixed on the piano. "I thought this was going to be a joke," he whispered to the person standing next to him. The other guest nodded quietly. "So did I." Across the room, a group of people who had been laughing earlier now watched with complete silence. Their expressions had changed from amusement to disbelief. The girl's playing did not look forced or nervous anymore. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her fingers moved across the keys with calm confidence, sometimes gliding smoothly from one side of the keyboard to the other. The melody shifted again, becoming deeper and more emotional. A few guests felt something unexpected while listening. It was difficult to explain, but the music seemed to reach beyond simple sound. It felt personal. A woman standing close to the piano felt her eyes becoming slightly watery. She was not sure why the melody affected her this way, but she could not look away. It was as if the girl was telling a story without speaking. The quiet struggles of long days. The small hopes that people carry even when life feels heavy. The simple beauty that can appear in unexpected places. All of it seemed to exist inside the music. Near the entrance of the hotel, one of the staff members who had allowed the girl inside earlier leaned slightly toward his coworker. "Did you know she could play like this?" he whispered. The other man shook his head slowly. "I thought she was just curious about the piano." Both of them watched in silence. Across the lobby, the man who had asked earlier who was playing now walked closer to the crowd. He listened carefully for a few seconds, studying the girl's hands as they moved across the keys. Something about her playing caught his attention immediately. He had spent many years around music. He had seen trained performers and experienced musicians play on stages much bigger than this hotel lobby. But the music he was hearing now carried something rare. It was raw, emotional, and completely natural. The girl was not reading from sheet music. There was no stand in front of her, no written notes guiding her fingers. Yet the melody flowed smoothly, with structure and balance. It felt alive. The man folded his arms thoughtfully, continuing to watch. Meanwhile, the girl remained lost in the music. She could feel the sound filling the space around her, and with every passing second she felt more connected to the piano. The nervousness she had felt earlier had completely disappeared. Now there was only the melody. Her fingers moved quickly through a brighter section of the song. The notes danced across the keyboard with surprising energy. Several guests exchanged glances of amazement. One person whispered softly, "How long has she been learning?" Another guest replied quietly, "I have no idea," but no one had an answer. The music shifted again, slowing down into a softer moment. The girl pressed the keys gently, creating a peaceful sound that seemed to float through the air. Outside the hotel windows, the city continued moving as usual. Cars passed by, and distant lights blinked along the busy street. But inside the lobby, the world felt completely different. Felt calm, focused, almost magical. The melody reached another emotional rise, and the girl's hands moved with renewed strength. The sound grew fuller, filling the tall space of the lobby with warmth. A waiter who had been standing near a table earlier now leaned slightly against the wall, listening carefully. Even people working that evening had forgotten their tasks for a moment. Everyone seemed connected by the music. The group of guests who had laughed earlier looked especially quiet now. One of them rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I didn't expect that," he murmured. Another person nodded slowly. No one did. The girl continued playing, unaware of their thoughts. Her mind followed the rhythm she had carried inside for so long. Every afternoon she had stood outside the same building, listening carefully to the piano through the glass doors. Every small detail she had absorbed during those quiet moments now seemed to guide her hands. The melody approached its final section. The notes became slower again, filled with calm emotion. People around the piano leaned slightly closer, not wanting the music to end. The man who had been watching carefully stepped forward just a little more. His expression had become serious now. He recognized something important in the girl's playing. Natural talent like this was rare. Very rare. The girl gently pressed the final sequence of notes. Each sound faded softly into the quiet air. Then the melody reached its final moment. Her fingers rested on the keys for one last second before lifting slowly. Silence filled the lobby. No one spoke. For a brief moment, it felt as if the entire room had forgotten how to move. The girl sat still on the bench, her hands resting in her lap again. She finally became aware of the crowd standing around her. Dozens of eyes were watching quietly. The same people who had laughed earlier were now completely silent. The girl felt unsure of what would happen next. She had only wanted to play one song, but the music had changed something in the room. And in the next few seconds, the reaction from the crowd would begin to show just how powerful that single song had been. For a few long seconds after the final note faded, the lobby remained completely silent. The girl sat quietly on the piano bench, her hands resting gently in her lap. She could feel many eyes on her now, and suddenly she became aware of just how many people had gathered around. Only minutes earlier, the room had been filled with laughter and casual conversations. Now it felt like the air itself had changed. No one spoke. No one moved. The girl looked down at the piano keys, unsure of what to do next. She had only planned to play one song. She had not expected the room to fall this quiet afterward. A small part of her wondered if she had done something wrong. Maybe she had stayed too long. Maybe she should stand up and quietly leave before someone asked her to. But before she could move, a single sound broke the silence. Clap. It was soft at first, coming from somewhere behind the small crowd. The girl looked up slightly. Another clap followed. Then another. Within seconds, the quiet lobby began filling with applause. At first it was gentle, almost careful. But quickly the clapping grew louder as more people joined in. Soon the entire room echoed with applause. Guests who had been watching in disbelief now clapped openly, some even shaking their heads with amazed smiles. A few people exchanged surprised looks, as if they were still trying to understand what they had just heard. The girl blinked in confusion. She had never received applause before. The sound felt overwhelming, but not in a frightening way. It was warm and sincere. Some guests even stepped closer to the piano, their expressions no longer filled with doubt, but with respect. Near the front of the crowd, one of the guests who had laughed earlier looked especially quiet now. His earlier confidence had disappeared. He clapped slowly, but his eyes showed something different, something close to regret. Not far away, a woman who had been standing near the piano during the performance wiped her eyes gently. "That was beautiful," she whispered to the person next to her. Across the room, the man who had been watching the girl carefully during the performance stepped forward. He did not clap immediately. Instead, he looked at the girl with a thoughtful expression, as if he were trying to understand something important. The applause continued for several more seconds before slowly fading. When the room finally became quieter again, the girl felt unsure of what to do. She slowly stood up from the bench. Her first instinct was to step away from the piano and leave the way she had come. But before she could walk far, the thoughtful man from the crowd approached her. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Excuse me," he said gently. The girl stopped and looked up at him. Up close, he looked older than many of the other guests, but his eyes carried a friendly curiosity rather than judgment. "That was a very special performance," he said. The girl lowered her eyes slightly, feeling shy. "Thank you," she replied softly. The man glanced toward the piano for a moment before asking another question. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The girl hesitated. Her answer felt almost too simple. "I didn't learn," she said quietly. The man blinked, surprised. "You didn't have lessons?" She shook her head. "I only listened." The small crowd nearby grew curious again. Several guests leaned closer, listening to the conversation. "You mean you've never taken piano lessons?" the man asked again. The girl nodded. "I used to stand outside this hotel sometimes," she explained. "I listened when people played." Some guests exchanged surprised glances. "You learned just by listening from outside?" someone in the crowd asked. The girl nodded again. "I remember the melodies," she said simply. The man looked back at the piano, then at the girl. For a moment he seemed almost speechless. Finally, a small smile appeared on his face. "That explains something," he said quietly. The girl tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked. The man gestured toward the piano. "Your playing feels natural," he said. "Not like someone repeating what they were taught. It feels real." Several people nearby nodded in agreement. One guest spoke up. "I thought she was going to press random keys," he admitted honestly. A few others laughed softly at the memory. "But that wasn't random at all," another guest added. The girl stood quietly, unsure how to respond. She had never thought of her playing in such complicated ways. To her, the music had always been simple. It was just something she felt. The thoughtful man looked around at the crowd before speaking again. "Do you know what kind of instrument you just played?" he asked gently. The girl looked back at the piano. "A piano," she replied. The man chuckled lightly. "Yes, but it's a professional grand piano. Musicians spend many years learning to play like that." The girl looked surprised. She had never thought about the instrument in that way. To her, it had simply been a beautiful object that created beautiful sounds. The man studied her expression for a moment. Then he asked another question. "How often do you practice?" The girl smiled slightly, almost embarrassed. "I practice on a table," she said. A few people in the crowd looked confused. "A table?" someone repeated. "At home," the girl explained quietly. "I tap the keys on the table and imagine the sounds." The guests around her fell silent again, absorbing the meaning of her words. One woman shook her head slowly in amazement. "You mean you learned all of that without a real piano?" The girl nodded. "Yes." The thoughtful man looked more serious now. He crossed his arms, thinking carefully. "You have something rare," he said finally. The girl looked uncertain. "I do?" she asked. He nodded. "Talent like that doesn't appear often." Around them, several guests began whispering again, but this time their voices carried admiration rather than mockery. Some people even approached the girl to compliment her playing. "That was wonderful," one guest said. "You made the entire room quiet," another added. The girl listened politely, still feeling a little overwhelmed by the attention. Only a short time ago, she had been standing outside the hotel, unsure if she would even be allowed inside. Now dozens of strangers were speaking to her kindly. The thoughtful man watched the scene for a moment before speaking again. "Would you be willing to play another song?" he asked gently. The girl looked surprised again. "You want me to play more?" she asked. Several people in the crowd nodded immediately. "Yes," someone said. "Please do," another guest added. The girl glanced toward the piano. A small smile appeared on her face. For the first time that evening, She felt completely comfortable sitting there. Slowly, she turned back toward the instrument. The room grew quiet once again as she approached the bench. But this time, the silence felt different. Earlier, people had been waiting for a mistake. Now they were waiting for music. The lobby became quiet again as the girl walked back toward the piano. This time, the silence felt very different from before. Earlier, people had been waiting to see something awkward or funny. Now they were simply waiting to hear the music again. She sat down slowly on the piano bench. The bright lights above reflected softly on the black surface of the instrument. Around her, the guests stood closer than before, forming a calm circle around the piano. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Everyone watched with patient curiosity. The girl placed her hands gently on the keys again. But before she started playing, she looked up for a moment at the people around her. Their faces were calm, interested, and respectful. It made her feel less nervous. She took a quiet breath and turned her attention back to the piano. Her fingers moved again. The first note sounded clear and warm in the quiet lobby. A soft melody slowly began to grow. It was different from the first song she had played. This one felt lighter, almost hopeful. The notes moved gently across the room like sunlight appearing after a cloudy day. The guests listened carefully. Some closed their eyes for a moment, letting the music settle in their thoughts. Others watched the girl's hands closely, amazed by how naturally she moved across the keyboard. The girl played without hesitation now. Her fingers moved freely, creating a melody that felt alive and peaceful. Even the hotel staff who had been busy earlier stood still nearby. One waiter leaned against the wall with a quiet smile while listening. Another employee paused near the entrance, completely focused on the music. Outside the large glass windows, the city continued its usual rhythm. Cars moved through the streets, and distant lights flickered in the night. But inside the hotel lobby, time seemed to slow down. The melody rose and fell like a gentle conversation. It carried warmth, calm, and something deeply human that everyone in the room could feel. The thoughtful man who had spoken to the girl earlier stood near the front of the crowd, listening carefully. The more he heard, the more certain he became about something important. This was not ordinary talent. The girl had never studied music in a classroom. She had never owned a piano. Yet the emotion in her playing felt honest and powerful. When the second song reached its final notes, the girl slowly lifted her hands from the keys again. Once again, silence filled the room. But this time the quiet lasted only a second before the applause returned. The sound of clapping echoed even louder than before. Some guests smiled widely. A few people even shook their heads in disbelief, as if they still could not understand how someone with no training could play like that. The girl stood up from the bench again, looking shy but happy. The thoughtful man stepped forward once more. "This is something very special," he said. The girl looked at him with curiosity. "You really believe that?" she asked softly. He nodded without hesitation. "I have spent many years around music," he explained. "I have heard many talented performers. But what you have is something different." The girl listened quietly. "You feel the music," he continued. "That is something people cannot always teach." Several guests standing nearby nodded in agreement. One woman spoke gently. "You made this whole room forget about everything else," she said. "That doesn't happen often." The girl smiled a little at their words. For most of her life, music had been something private. It had lived quietly inside her imagination, while she walked past the hotel windows or tapped melodies on the small table in her room. She had never expected strangers to listen so carefully. The thoughtful man folded his arms again and looked at her with a serious but kind expression. "I would like to help you," he said. The girl looked surprised. "Help me?" she asked. "Yes," he replied calmly. "You should have a chance to learn music properly. Real lessons. A real piano to practice on." The girl blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "A real piano?" she repeated. He nodded. "You deserve the opportunity." Around them, several guests began quietly agreeing with the idea. "That would be wonderful," someone said. "She has a gift," another person added. The girl looked down for a moment, thinking about what he had said. Her life had always been simple. School during the day, helping her mother when she returned home from work, listening to music through hotel windows. The idea of learning music professionally felt almost too big to imagine. But lessons are expensive, she said honestly. The man smiled gently. Sometimes the right opportunity appears when people least expect it. The girl did not know what to say. For a moment she looked back at the piano. Just a short time ago, she had stood outside the same building wondering if she would ever be brave enough to touch those keys. Now her life seemed to be changing in front of her eyes. The thoughtful man reached into his pocket and took out a small card. He handed it to her. "If you truly love music," he said, "come visit this place tomorrow." The girl looked at the card carefully. She did not fully understand everything written on it, but she could see the name of a music academy printed clearly. Her eyes widened slightly. "You mean I could really learn there?" she asked. The man nodded. "Yes, and I believe you will do very well." The girl held the card gently, almost as if it were something fragile. Around her, the guests continued smiling and speaking kindly. The atmosphere that once held laughter and doubt had completely changed. Respect had taken its place. One of the guests who had laughed earlier stepped forward awkwardly. "I'm sorry about before," he said quietly. The girl looked at him and simply nodded. She did not seem angry. In her mind, none of that mattered anymore. The only thing she could think about was the piano, and the future that suddenly felt possible. A few minutes later, the crowd slowly began returning to the evening event. Conversation started again, but the mood in the room felt different now. Several people continued talking about the girl and her music. Some guests even glanced toward the piano again, as if remembering the moment they had just witnessed. The girl eventually stepped away from the instrument. As she walked toward the hotel entrance, she turned back for one last look at the piano. The same instrument she had once admired from outside the window. Tonight it had changed everything. When she stepped outside, the night air felt cool and fresh. The city lights stretched across the street, and the sounds of passing cars returned to her ears. But inside her pocket, the small card remained safe in her hand. It represented something new, a chance. As she began walking home through the quiet streets, the melody she had played earlier echoed softly in her mind. The girl who once stood outside the glass doors listening to music had finally played her own song. And from that moment forward, the world around her would never feel the same again.